Welcome everybody. My name is Evelyn Goh and I'm the Shedden Professor of Strategic Policy Studies at the Australian National University, which is where I am convening this webinar from today. I would like to begin with an important convention that we follow here by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose lands we meet. The ANU is located in the Australian Capital Territory, and the traditional custodians of this land are the Ngunnawal people. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Welcome to this very first event of the Women in Asia Pacific Security Research Seminar Series. It's lovely to see our live audiences, and to those of you who will be tuning in later to view our recording, greetings. And we hope to be able to engage with you live in one of our later seminars in the series. Our aim in this series is to showcase the research of some excellent scholars working on Asia Pacific security today, who happen to be women. Now, I often hear the complaint that there are so few women working in this area. And it is true that male scholars rather significantly outnumber female scholars in the field of Asia Pacific security. But it is also true that there is stellar and path-breaking work in this area and being done by some women scholars who are in this field. So our aim in this series is to encourage everybody and to broaden all our horizons through exposure to such work. So today we are delighted to kick off with a very distinguished panel speaking on the theme, what's so special about Asian security, with a specific focus on economics and institutions. It gives me very great pleasure to welcome three great friends to help us kick off this series. First of all, we have Professor Natasha Hamilton-Hart, who is professor in the Department of Management and International Business and the director of the New Zealand Asia Institute at the University of Auckland. Her research has investigated the dynamics of economic integration in East Asia, informal institutions, and the international relations of Southeast Asia, with an emphasis on regional perceptions of the United States and China. Welcome, Natasha. Then we have Elizabeth Thurbon, who is the Scientia Associate Professor of International Relations and International Political Economy at the University of New South Wales, where she is also Deputy Head Research of the School of Social Sciences. Elizabeth's research specialism is the political economy of techno-industrial transformation and economic statecraft. Welcome, Liz. And we have also with us Alice Barr, who is Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Delaware. Alice's primary research interests consider the interactions between ASEAN, Southeast Asian actors, and larger powers in regional integration and cooperative regime building. Welcome, Alice, and we're so glad you can be with us. Now we're going to proceed in the following way. We'd like to, with the speaker's agreement and to give Alice a bit of a breathing space, Liz, if it's okay, we'd like to start with you, followed by Natasha, and then Alice, if that's okay with you. Thank you so much for that last minute change. We're going to proceed like this. Each of the speakers will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes with some opening remarks related to the theme of today's seminar. We shall then spend the remaining 20 to 25 minutes, which I hope we'll have, on a wider discussion, including a Q&A with the participants, okay? So for the Q&A, please can I invite the seminar participants, if possible, to pose your questions using the chat function, and I shall then try and use mixed methods to ensure that we can address as many discussion points as possible with the panel. Okay, now to assist with the stability of the internet connection, can I ask members of the live audience at this point, please to turn off your video and to keep yourself muted as I hand over to the speakers for their short opening remarks. Thank you so much. And let's turn over to the speakers. Liz, if it's okay for you to kick off, please go ahead. Thank you.
Absolutely. And can you hear me, Evelyn?
Yes,
Great.
very well.
Wonderful, wonderful. Look, it's thank you so much for having me. It's really great to have a chance to exchange ideas with such a wonderful panel and to connect virtually, at least in these really worrying times. And I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm coming to you from today, which is Wongal land here in Sydney. I have to say, I really love the title of this seminar series, What's So Special About Asian Security Research? And this is a really important question to ask because it really presses us to think and to clearly articulate what it is that makes our area of research truly distinctive. And for me, there are at least two key aspects to the distinctiveness of Asian security dynamics, which in turn the distinctiveness of Asian security research. And the first the first aspect is this distinctive relationship between politics and economics in the region, or more specifically, the distinctive ways in which external threat perceptions and national security anxieties have really shaped economic ambitions and policy approaches, especially in East Asia, which is the focus of my own research. It's now very well known that in the post-World War II period, many East Asian governments came to view a strong economy as the essential foundation of their national security. And this is particularly true of the wealthiest and most materially powerful countries of Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and now, of course, China. And by a strong economy, I don't just mean a big economy, but a strong techno-industrial economy, an economy that actually makes things and in which local firms possess a degree of technological autonomy and are really hungry to catch up with foreign rivals and to eventually compete at the technological frontier. So in other words, in East Asia, arguably, I think more than in any other region of the world, many governments view national security principally through the lens of economic security and see this relentless pursuit of techno-industrial transformation and competitiveness as an essential part of their broader national security strategies. And I think it's worth pointing out that we, as scholars of East Asian security, have had to grapple with conceptualizing this idiosyncratic interrelationship between politics and economics in the region. And this grappling in turn has led to some quite significant conceptual innovations. The most influential of these, of course, in the economic arena, I think has been the pioneering concept of the developmental state. And more recently, I, along with colleagues, have offered the related concepts of the developmental mindset, of developmental environmentalism, and of domestically focused geo-economic statecraft, bit of a mouthful there, to which I'll return in a bit, all of which try to capture aspects of this relationship between national security concerns and economic ambitions that is so characteristic of the region. And this brings me to my second point about the distinctiveness of Asian security dynamics, and that is the extent to which this distinctive relationship between politics and economics in East Asia has produced a series of unprecedentedly rapid techno-industrial transformations, which in turn have had major global strategic consequences. So from the end of World War II to the end of the Cold War in the 90s, we saw national security concerns and ambitions really drive the rapid techno-industrial transformation of Japan and South Korea and Taiwan. And that first transformative wave lifted tens of millions out of poverty and helped kickstart wider regional growth. And it also shifted the center of global economic activity to East Asia and gave rise to debates that Japan would overtake the US in economic terms. And since the end of the Cold War, we've seen national security considerations and ambitions really drive the even more rapid techno-industrial transformation of China. And this second transformative wave has already lifted nearly 1 billion out of poverty. And it hasn't just cemented East Asia as the centre of global economic gravity, but it's made it the centre of geostrategic gravity as well. So today the US worries not just about China's challenge to its economic supremacy, but also to its military primacy, its hegemony. And it's here, of course, that so much of today's global security research is quite understandably focused. But my message today is that this is not the end of the transformative story in East Asia. And the point that I want to make today is that we're now seeing national security concerns and ambitions drive a third wave of techno-industrial transformation in East Asia, but this time a very different and somewhat surprising transformation, and one that the world quite desperately needs. So today we're seeing national security concerns drive a rapid clean energy shift in East Asia, which involves the enthusiastic embrace of clean energies and related technologies and the growing rejection of fossil fuels. And this transformative wave isn't just occurring in China, but we see it happening in South Korea and in Taiwan and in Japan as well. So to put it as plainly as possible, what currently makes East Asian security dynamics so distinctive, in my view, are two things. First, the speed and scale of the clean energy transition that's currently underway in the region. While many countries across the globe, possibly not Australia, are now embarking on a clean energy shift, East Asian countries are pursuing this transition in their characteristically very ambitious way. And in the past couple of months we've seen really striking evidence of that ambition. We've seen President Xi committing China to a zero net emissions by 2060, and Japan and Korea announcing net zero goals by 2050. And these developments were really unthinkable to most, at least to most outside observers, until quite recently. And the pace and scale of East Asia's clean energy shift means it's not just going to have massive economic and strategic consequences, not only for the region, but also for the world. And hopefully it will also have major climatic consequences, helping to address climate change. And this brings us, I think, to the second distinctive feature of the clean energy shift in East Asia, which is the extent to which this shift is being driven not by concerns about climate change, at least not principally, but primarily traditional national security concerns and related economic ambitions. And my message, not just for scholars of Asian security, but for the Australian policymakers in particular, is that unless we really understand the national security considerations and the economic ambitions that are driving the clean energy shift in Asia, it's going to be really hard for us to anticipate the likely direction of that shift and to grasp what it means for Australia's own security, economic, geostrategic and environmental, and to respond in sensible ways. So explaining the drivers and dynamics of East Asia's clean energy shift is currently the focus of my ARC Discovery project with my collaborators Sun Young Kim and John Matthews and Hao Tan. So it's really lovely to be able to share with you some of our ideas today. And the basic premise of our argument really is that to make sense of East Asia's clean energy shift, you really have to understand what's driving it and what's shaping its technological direction. And for that, you have to start with the long-standing developmental orientations and ambitions of the governments in question. In other words, you have to start with the long-standing developmental mindset of the policy and political elite. So what I mean by the developmental mindset, very briefly, in my 2016 book of the same title, I coined this term to encapsulate the set of beliefs about the essential relationship between politics and economics that has informed economic policy making in many East Asian countries since the end of World War II. And so the developmental mindset involves a unifying set of ideas about the primary purpose of economic activity, which is national security and international prestige, about the state's main economic goals, which are manufacturing capacity, technological autonomy, and export competitiveness, and about the appropriate role for the state in achieving those goals, which is strategic activism. And in my book, I argued that we should consider the developmental mindset as the defining and the unifying feature of East Asia's so-called developmental states. And this mindset-centered definition of a developmental state is really different from dominant understandings, which have tended to define these states very much in formal institutional or organizational terms, including the centralized bureaucracies and pilot agencies, etc., and to arguably neglect their more foundational ideational aspects. So my argument was that in reality, the formal organizational characteristics of developmental states actually vary quite significantly between states and evolve within states over time. So taking the developmental mindset as my analytical starting point and South Korea as a case study, I was able to show how popular claims about developmental state demise and neoliberal transformation in East Asia have been very much overstated. More specifically, I was able to show how the developmental mindset remains really strong in South Korea, thanks in no small part to the emergence of new external threats, especially the rise of China, the existential challenge of climate change, and that this mindset continues to shape a highly strategic approach to techno-industrial governance. So along with my ARC team, we're now employing this kind of mindset-centered analysis to explain East Asia's clean energy shift with a particular focus on South Korea and China. And our argument is that policymakers in South Korea and China are not promoting clean energies because of climate change concerns, at least not principally. Rather, they're motivated principally by energy security concerns associated with their enormous reliance on fossil fuels for their energy needs. And this fossil fuel reliance exposes Korea and China to dramatic energy price fluctuations caused by factors beyond their control, not least geopolitical tensions in countries like Iran and Sudan, along with growing environmental concerns about climate change. And this energy price volatility poses a serious risk to the international competitiveness of these countries' energy-intensive, export-oriented manufacturing industries that have long underpinned their successful development strategies, which are of course seen as foundational to national security. So by vigorously promoting clean energies, Korean and Chinese policymakers are now seeking to solve their energy and economic security concerns in one hit, basically by manufacturing energy security, in a term nicely encapsulated or coined by John Matthews and Hao Tan, and in vying for leadership in the high-tech, high-wage, export-oriented green industries of the future. So a key part of our analysis involves tracing this shift at the level of the official mindset of the policy and political elite, from traditional developmentalism to what Son Young Kim and I have called developmental environmentalism. And in this mindset, the traditional developmental goals of manufacturing capacity and technological autonomy and export competitiveness retain their centrality, but the established means of achieving those goals by promoting fast followership in the fossil fueled manufacturing industries of the past is viewed as no longer viable for various reasons. And in light of these, the kind of political and economic costs of that traditional strategy, and in the context of an enduring developmental commitment, policymakers believe that the state can and should step in to change the strategic direction of the economy and to help secure leadership in the technologically advanced, environmentally friendly manufacturing industries of the future. So in sum, East Asia's clean energy shift really reflects and embodies this long-standing developmental orientation and ambition, and the emergence of a new techno-economic strategy centered on developmental environmentalism. So I'm probably pushing up, I would say, against the time that I have. So just to conclude, very briefly about the implications of that for the wider global security dynamics. Well, despite the somewhat conventional national security motivations that are driving East Asia's clean energy shift, the global implications could be very positive. These countries make major contributions to global emissions, so their dedicated greening efforts will really help to significantly drive down global emissions. East Asia's embrace of a clean energy shift and their growing rejection of fossil fuels also has profound economic and geostrategic implications for Australia, insofar as our own economic security is tied up with fossil fueled exports to the region. And we can come back to the implications of that perhaps in the discussion. So I'd just like to sum up by saying that the point I'd really like to conclude with is that East Asia is currently in the middle of another major transformative shift, a clean energy shift. What distinguishes that shift from that taking place elsewhere isn't just the dramatic pace and scope, but it's the security related, or more specifically, the developmental drivers of East Asia's clean energy shift that are also really distinctive and that warrant dedicated analysis. And the broader message is that if anyone still thought that the relationship between politics and economics was somehow normalizing in East Asia and that these countries were destined to converge on a more liberal model of economic governance, I think the ongoing influence of developmental ideas and the distinctive role of the state in East Asia's clean energy shift give us at least a little bit of pause for thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Liz, for that incredibly strong start to both this panel and the series. That was an admirable use of 15 minutes to great effect, I think. Thank you so much. And can I take the opportunity before handing over to Natasha to say that, you know, amongst the participants at today's seminar are some other scholars also who have been, you know, in their own works, pushing the boundaries and exploring this idea of developmentalism and the connections between politics and security in other parts of East Asia, including Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia as well. I can see on my screen that my colleague Amy King is with us, and Amy's doing some important work, particularly on China and Japan in this area. Our friend Helen Nessajurai from Monash Malaysia is also with us, and Helen, of course, has been working on some of these key themes from Southeast Asia. In addition, I can see Wu Fengshi as well, and our other colleagues from the ANU, Wes Whitmire, who works in these areas of political economy too. So thank you for joining us, and I'm sure we'll have quite a lot to go on in the conversation going forward. Let me turn to Natasha for your remarks. Please, Natasha, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Evelyn, and I'm honoured and delighted to be part of this panel. Let me start with an old observation, which is that security outcomes are driven by the ways that state actors juggle three motivating forces, and these forces are fear, interest, and honour. And I take those terms from Thucydides as summarized and expertly discussed in a recent article by Jonathan Kirshner. Fear, interest, and honor, of course, map quite well on the more familiar terms of security, economics, and identity, which are very well known to scholars in this region and also form the subtitle of a really good book edited by Yul Son and TJ Pempel, in which Evelyn Goh has a really great chapter on China in the region. My argument today is that domestic state institutions constrain and enable the ways these three forces play out, and that this has implications for regional security. But I want to make it very clear at the outset that there is no such thing as an Asian state institution. In fact, what I see when I look at the region is a great variety of state institutions. And they shape the security dynamics of the region, I think, in two ways. One in which the state institutions of a particular shape, of a particular state, shape the pursuit of security, material interest, or honor. And different state institutions produce characteristic differences in the ways that fear, interest, and honor play out. In this sense, the region is probably not very special. Because of the great variety of states in the region, I think you could almost take any country anywhere in the world and find some kind of analogous state in East Asia. But perhaps what is more special to the region is that it is a region in which dissimilar states are very closely intertwined in economic terms. And perhaps this close relationship of heterogeneous units does make the region kind of special, especially if we compare it to Europe, where the states are much more similar to each other. So with that on the table, I want to do three things. And one is to briefly remind you of what state institutions do. Two is to sketch the distribution of state institutional types in the region. And three is to suggest how this variation in state institutional types has shaped regional relations. So first, a quick backgrounder on what state institutions do. Firstly, of course, the state system as a sort of governing system works as a preference aggregation device, which if you work in the open economy politics tradition, this will be very familiar. But I think more interestingly, and perhaps in ways that are still not fully appreciated, state capacity in terms of the organization of the core state bureaucracy has an enormous influence on how effectively and consistently any state policy is actually implemented. And this state capacity resides in what can approximately be called a sort of rules-based Weberian rational legal set of state organizations, which is not the same thing as a state system that is governed by an overriding sense of legalism or even the rule of law, which in fact can, in certain circumstances, be quite disabling to state capacity. I think the core feature for me is that the state organizations possess an efficient hierarchy, a disciplined hierarchy. And hierarchy, as per the transaction costs tradition, hierarchy is efficient in certain circumstances because it allows for action on the basis of authority as opposed to rules. If you have this kind of state capacity in the core organizations of the state, it means that the state actors have a wider toolkit for policy choice. So here I would differ from Liz Thurbon's wonderful take on the developmental mindset, because when I look at some of the Southeast Asian states, you know, the mindset may be there, but the organizational apparatus is not, and this matters. So with a greater set of viable policies, which I think we've seen in the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, states can pursue a sort of, you know, a broader tapestry of choice. Now that doesn't replace politics. Politics will still drive policy choice, but the limits are different. And I would also note that the capacity as internal discipline also shapes the interface with business or indeed other actors, both domestically and in foreign policy terms. I move on to the issue, the sort of the empirical issue of what kind of states inhabit the region. And I would see probably three broad types. And obviously this is going to do violence to some of the differences within those types. But on the one hand, we have a set of this sort of the archetypal well-known developmental states, mostly in Northeast Asia, but also including Singapore. These are rule-based hierarchical bureaucracies with extensive extractive capacity, a good ability to control crime, And based off that organizing capacity, both a high level of policy ambition and reasonable effectiveness in delivering on that ambition. In stark contrast, I would see states like the Philippines, Indonesia, and Cambodia as representing more of a sort of patrimonial archetype, very porous, personalized state systems, which quite predictably throw up a very large gap between the policy intent and the policy as declared and what actually gets implemented on the ground. And then in the middle, you've got a group which have a sort of bundle of characteristics, and it might play out differently in different sectors, where you've got Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. Now, I'm not sure Vietnam might actually fit better in the sort of more disciplined hierarchical state systems. I don't know the country as well. Thirdly, with this variation in mind, what are some of the implications for regional relations and security? So when I said that state capacity shapes the mixture of fear, interest, and honor that determines your foreign policy or your security practice, that means looking at what do those things mean from the perspective of an actor in a particular state system. And that, I think, tells us that although all of the states in the region, probably all states everywhere, care about economic interests and development, but they vary significantly in how strategically these interests manifest. So if, as a disciplined state with a wider repertoire of domestic policy tools, those states also have a wider repertoire of tools when it comes to projecting interests internationally and pursuing them internationally. So they are more able to engage in statecraft, for instance, in ways that you know, an Indonesia or a Cambodia just cannot. When you look at the more porous states, and this is an observation that of course has been made a long time ago by scholars of third world states, the overriding security concerns are domestic and hinge extraordinarily to, you know, around regime security and distributional concerns that go along with keeping a particular regime in power. So although we see an alignment across, I think, almost all of East Asia on what Evelyn Goh has called a developmental imperative and a regional consensus favoring state-centric developmentalism, to use her term. This plays out in very different ways in different countries. I'll come back to that in a moment. But when we look at the security concerns of the more porous states in the region, and see how much they're concerned with regime survival, the threats are not primarily external, they are domestic threats. And this, you know, the Indonesian military was obsessed with the threat of communism long, long after China had become a profit-seeking center of capitalism, and the Berlin Wall had come down, and the concern with national integrity continues to animate military thinking in Indonesia. And it's not really so much from threats from without, but threats from within. If you look at what's happening in Thailand right now, it's very hard to imagine that security for the Thai government right now is going to be seen in their ability to survive the protests that they're facing. And, you know, what does a rising China mean? What primarily it means was, well, what can you do for us right now confronting these protesters? If I were to turn to the ways these differences in state capacity shape their pursuit of interest and their perception of threat domestically, but then what happens when you put states with these very different capacities and outlooks together in one region? And I think this is possibly an area where East Asia is a little bit special, because it has integrated very, very closely scholars who started looking at the regionalization of the economies of the East Asia and sort of started referring to it as a regionalization without regionalism, that the economic integration proceeded far in advance of the formal regional cooperation agenda. And I'm thinking of work in the 1990s by Richard Donner and Peter Doverne, who looked at the role of Japanese firms in creating an economic interdependence and integration with Southeast Asia, the resource-rich economies of Malaysia and Indonesia in particular, by using the tools of patrimonial diplomacy to penetrate the decision-making structures of these states, while at the same time being materially aided and supported by a much more strategic coordinating role played by the Japanese state. You can see similar processes unfolding in other areas. Work by Helena Vaki in Malaysia has looked at how the palm oil industry has been sustained through a sort of patronage-based, patronage extrapolated to the regional scale, which has not only led the economic integration, but has also undermined the attempts to actually cooperate to do anything about the negative fallout as a result of that integration. A long time ago, I had a go at trying to look at the ways in which these differences in state capacity affected the prospects for regional cooperation when it came to problem-solving issues. Like, it's been very conducive to integration, but not very helpful for actually solving in a more proactive way the sort of concrete cooperation agenda that ASEAN still struggles with today. I think this variation in state capacity can also throw some light on what are the current issues that are provoking both sort of anxiety and hope in the region. When you look at things such as the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and the clear emergence of a Sino-centric regional economy, it is quite clear that no regional state has a preference for Chinese hegemony. Except, possibly Cambodia, which you could describe as a sort of client state of China. But for the others, I don't think there's any acceptance that, they wish to see a region dominated by China. But I think that the poorest states in the region are caught in the contradictions of their own policy and their own capacities. So when it comes to Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Thailand, they have been enmeshed for over 20 years now in a trajectory of deepening relational ties, which have sustained a very high degree of economic integration, and which we currently see playing out in some of the big Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure projects. And these are at odds with their desire to carve out an independent foreign policy and safeguard national security interests. And that is why you see what look like very, very contradictory statements coming out of the Philippines, for instance, where on the one hand, you have senators and some of the members of the armed forces complaining very loudly about Chinese.
Natasha, we seem to have lost you.
I don't know if everyone else has lost me.
You're back, Natasha.
I'm back.
You may have to wind
right.
back.
I was just wrapping up, actually, which is to say that, a lot of the contradictory statements that you see coming out of different players in countries like the Philippines, I think show, on the one hand, the economic enmeshment that is continuing apace, sustained by very sort of personal and direct interests. And that is often in contradiction to the security concerns that policymakers in those same states also articulate. But I'm now actually getting a message on my own computer saying my internet is unstable. So maybe that is a good reason to pause at this point.
Thank you so much, Natasha. Thank you. And thank you so much for keeping to time. We did hear everything you had to say, I'm pretty sure. And thanks for what really strikes me is your really timely reminder that, there is huge variation across the region. And I take your point about, that when we think about what is special about Asian political economy, we'd want to think about more subtle questions as well, about some aspects of which it's not so special. But I think you've actually done a great job in highlighting what's distinctive, some aspects in which Asian security practice is distinctive, following on nicely from what Liz started us off with. I'm also very pleased that you've provided us the segue into the East Asian region as a whole, which allows us now to think about Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia together in a good transition to what I'm sure Alice will bring to the table as well. So Alice, please can I turn over to you for your 10 to 15 minutes, and then we can take all these themes together, I think. Thanks, Alice.
Sure. Thank you very much. And I apologize for coming in late. We completely forgot that we changed, we fell back last night, and so we did not account for the time change. And so again, apologies for keeping everybody waiting. I'm going to, so number one, as the others have already said, I'm very pleased to be part of this inaugural series and webinar. Thank you very much, Evelyn, for including me on this. I'm also excited to be part of the conversation and of course to be with some very fabulous women here. So I'm going to focus mostly on regional organizations and basically as intergovernmental creations. Though, you know, certainly an important point that I've made previously and I would want to say now is that I think that we can also think about the way in which we think about organizations is also often overly constrained, right? And so I think we can think about institutions and institutionalization more broadly as a way to also capture the various things that are being institutionalized and the various ways in which institutions and regional organizations as one expression of institutions affect Asian security. The starting question for this webinar was, you know, what's so special about Asian security? And some of us have had kind of an ongoing discussion about this. And I think we're not going to resolve that question here, but I will just simply say that I think that there are a lot of familiar forms in Asia, but some of the logics, some of the dynamics and causal mechanisms by which they work may also vary. And that, of course, is where region-specific research comes into play. I'm going to actually approach this question by starting actually with just a couple kind of recurrent challenges, I think, in terms of the security agenda and how we approach regional organizations in Asia. I thought, so the first is actually a problem that was identified by Evelyn and Rosemary Foote's 2018 article, which is, of course, a tendency, I think, to think in terms of binaries and dichotomies. I think we're all familiar with Asia's defining debates. You know, is it ripe for peace, ripe for conflict or rivalry, stability versus change? The ASEAN debate is certainly rife with dichotomies defined by dichotomies. And at some point, I think that these binary debates become a little bit useless, right? Because they say more about us than it does about what's going on in terms of Asian security or in terms of Asia's regional institutions. As I've said in more than one previous setting, Asia is messy, and so it's going to be a mix of different things. And trying to figure out how those things come together and how they interact with one another, I think is an important part of our security agenda, and that includes for regional organizations. In Asia, and I'm going to come back to this point again, it's one that Natasha already made, but basically in Asia, we find different kinds of actors, right? We find different actors that are not just different in size, which is what we often emphasize, but also different actors in kind, right? We find different kinds of institutional arrangements. We find arrangements that have different desired security effects, different driving actors, and all of these are part of the mix that make up Asian security. On the specific question of regional organizations in Asia, I think there are also some really important differences between actors, between participating states, in terms of what they think regional organizations are for, and what they prioritize out of those regional organizations. What's interesting, of course, about Asia is that they are participating in common frameworks, right? And so thinking in terms of binaries, again, is not that useful in terms of thinking about some of this messiness and also the interactive effects that come from the interactions between different actors, different arrangements, different kinds of institutions. A second recurring challenge that I might also highlight here in terms of the agenda is that there is oftentimes, I think, an overemphasis on structure. An overemphasis on structure in terms of how we think about security and also regional organizations. I think that we can all agree that structure matters, but structure is also created by our social and discursive interactions. And I think this is also why regional organizations are interesting for security, because regional organizations have been created in part for the precise purpose of expanding that world of interactions. So again, and so I think that, that remains an area that we can certainly explore further. A third related challenge is actually twofold, and it's what I might call an interdependent great power and status quo bias in terms of how we think about what regional organizations do. On each of these challenges, I think research on regional institutions in East Asia offers some interesting intersections with security, and also some paths by which to transcend some of the challenges that I've just identified. I think that these intersections between regional organizations and Asian security are made interesting by at least two categories of distinction. I think the first are the distinctive features associated with regional organizations as political expressions of collective enterprise, right? And then the second category of distinction has to do with Asia itself, which is the distinctive features associated with Asia and the mix of actors and arrangements that we find there. And so, for example, what makes regional organizations as a category of regional activity, as a category of collective enterprise interesting, is that they are multi-actor platforms, right? Similarly, what makes Asia interesting is that the region is comprised of a distinct mix and range, a distinct mix and a wide range of states and actors. We actually don't talk enough about this, I think, for those of us who work on regional organizations. I think we don't talk enough about the range of actors that constitute Asia. We talk a lot about large actors and we talk a lot about small actors. We talk about the presence of status quo powers versus revisionist powers. But in fact, as we've already heard from both Liz and Natasha, we actually have a range of different kinds of economies, different kinds of states with different institutional capacities. And all of these states are interacting in these common platforms provided by regional organizations. ASEAN associated frameworks, for example, are arguably among some of the most, participant diverse organizations to look at. Partly due to the mix of actors we find in Asia, but of course they've all come together partly also because of the priorities that are distinctive to ASEAN itself. Right? So regional organizations, for example, can certainly be smaller. They can be much more focused on a narrower set of states. But in Asia, we find a range of frameworks, some of which are quite broadly inclusive, associated with ASEAN in particular, that again bring these distinctive features of Asia into basically one room. Okay. There's been a lot, and then furthermore, and this of course raises or brings into the question that Natasha had also brought in, and that is that, what happens when you put these states with such different capacities, different mindsets, and different drivers all together trying to create one platform. I think most of the time when we think about it in these ways, we think about how cooperation is constrained, right? We think about how cooperation is constrained. In Asia, we also talk about how the institutions start breaking off or states start creating, new frameworks, right? New minilateral frameworks. But this also becomes part of the diversity of Asia, right? So now we have a wide range of actors operating in both common as well as different frameworks, and also frameworks that are also coexisting with one another. On this question about the wide range of institutions that we find, or regional frameworks that we find in Asia, there's been a lot of discussion, of course, in terms of how these new frameworks are designed to compete with one another. But another way to also think about that is that they're also, because they coexist, they also have to respond to one another, they have to interact with one another, and they also have to accommodate one another in some important ways. And so because it's not just interactions between two frameworks, but many, right, that adds to kind of the complexity of outcomes that we might find by looking at regional institutional dynamics. Taken together, I think that these institutional interactions have security effects, whether it's the kinds of foreign policy tools that are available to states, the processes by which states compete or cooperate. In short, Asia's distinct mix of actors and the plethora of varied arrangements that we find adds additional layers of distinction to Asian security, right? When it comes to both regional organizations as institutionalized political outcomes, and as a phenomenon and a contributing factor to Asian security, right? So in other words, I would maintain that, an interesting area to think about is that regional institutions are not simply an outcome of what we find in Asia, but they are also contributing to some of the larger geopolitical changes that we're also seeing in Asia today, right? Evelyn asked in my last few minutes to maybe touch a little bit on some of the things that we're working on, and here I'll simply highlight kind of two areas of research interest that I've been working on. These are works in progress, some building on work that I've done in the past, right? And each of these research areas are united by a common concern for pluralism, right? A concern for pluralism is a distinct feature of intergovernmental frameworks. The first of my agendas that I'll touch upon here is how regional cooperative security regimes can take different forms in Asia, reflective of that different mix of actors. And then the second is more comparative, in the sense that it is interested in comparing regional and global organizational dynamics and the different ways they account for pluralism. Okay, so on the first, as noted, in Asia, an important development has been an increase in both the number and range of potential security providers. Okay, and this is again partly facilitated also by regional institutions. An important feature of Asia is the presence of large and small actors and the different ways that cooperative regimes can be configured. Recent work has tended to focus on large actors providing and setting agendas. And of course, a lot of that discussion falls along the lines that are more akin to hegemonic stability or hegemonic leading kinds of arguments. But in Asia, this is just one form. And what I want to also suggest here is that that it's not just that small or middle powers are also find in regional frameworks platforms to also set agendas. It's that in the mix between the different kinds of actors, we're actually finding different expressions with different sets of responsibilities, right? My work on the cooperative mechanism on the Straits of the Malacca and Singapore, for example, provides one example of an alternative model of governance and regime building that challenges conventional characterizations of regional governance, what it looks like, its defining concerns, and its leading actors, right? In that case, on the one hand, Japan played an outsized role as a large actor with resources. But that piece also drew attention to the role played by a non-state actor in shaping the mix of actors that came together, private as well as state actors, the role of Southeast Asia's littoral states in agenda setting, and also the result being a hybrid regime with varied obligations and contributions, and then also raise a lot of questions about some standard explanations that are about event-driven explanations of cooperation. It can also be characterized as an early example of mini-lateralism, right? As for the more comparative agenda, I'll just simply say this in my last minute here, is that, you know, both regional and global organizations, again, because regional international organizations are defined by the mix of different actors. That's what they do, right? They bring together a range of different actors. And so my concern is anchored again by this concern for pluralism as a distinct feature of intergovernmental frameworks. They're pluralist by design, and they bring together a range of different actors. And regardless of how an organization is designed, that internal pluralism has to be accounted for. I think one of the things that we have opportunity to pursue further is also to think about the different legitimation challenges that are faced by regional and global institutions, both of which hold pluralism as a value, right? But they have a different mix of states when we think about global governance institutions versus, for example, institutions at the regional level and in the Asian context in particular. In both cases, we find expanded membership and the challenges posed by expanded membership, and similar needs to accommodate that new and expanded pluralism. But because of different contextual and substantive driving factors in how those organizations and institutions were created, the mix of actors that played leading roles, you also have different pathways by which those institutions adapt to that pluralism, right? So I'll just simply end it up there since I'm out of time, and to allow for a larger discussion.
Alice, thank you so much. I hope you can hear me. I've got construction going on next door, so it's a little bit noisy. Could I, at this point, thank Alice and highlight a couple of things that she's brought up, which I think speak very well to what the previous two speakers have already put on the table. Alice, of course, has reminded us of the difficulties of, you know, insisting on sticking to binaries, which you know, are a device in much conceptual thinking, either in IR or IPE, that can be helpful. But when engaging in regional work, serves to limit the extent of what we can try to account for in a complex region such as East Asia. Of course, we're not suggesting that Asia is the only complex region. All regions are complex in their own right, and that emphasizes the need to identify, I think, within limits, what are some of the distinctive elements of specialness in the region under study that might give us more leverage in how we think about the analysis and the research that we might want to do. I also found very useful at the end, Alice, your illustrations about pluralism, and you're sort of doubling down on the point that, you know, we very often under account for the plurality and the diversity of actors in the security as well as economic realm in the region. And I think that constitutes a theme that we may want to take forward in our broader discussion in the remaining time that we've got. So we have about 20 minutes remaining in this session. I'd like to open this up to the participants who've taken time to join us today. Please may I invite you, as I said before, if possible, to send me your questions that you have on the chat function. You're also very welcome, if you like, to raise your hand, to use the hand raising function on Zoom to pose your questions to the speakers as well. Between us, we'll try and keep an eye on this. at this point also, because we've got a reasonable sized audience, may I also invite you perhaps, if we can sustain this, to turn your videos on so we can have a better sense of, seeing each other and participating with each other on Zoom. Let's hope we can sustain some of this. So if you're comfortable, please turn your videos on, especially if you'd like to pose some questions to the speakers. So I've got on a chat function an initial question from Wu Fengshi, who came back earlier and asked if we might take the opportunity to see if Liz and Natasha would like to to push a bit on the remarks that Natasha made in her presentation, and to see if Liz could respond to Natasha's suggestion that perhaps the developmental mentality is there and is distinctive. To what extent would you sort of come back at Natasha's suggestion that there's a distinction between that developmental mentality and the capacity actually to do something about it, which varies across the region? So something for Liz there from Wu Fengshi, and to give you a bit of time to think about this. I also have a question. I'm going to read out two questions to give the panel some time to think. Second question from Yoichiro Sato. Hi, Yoichiro. If you don't mind, I'm just going to read it for you because it's here. Yoichiro suggests that, we've got globalizing businesses which have built, global and regional value chains, right? And we're also seeing US-led efforts, right, to change those global value and supply chains into which, so many of the Asian economies we've been talking about are so indelibly sort of plugged into. And really the question is one about the extent to which the speakers might see this as a fairly dangerous moment when the US, through these efforts at decoupling and sort of dismantling and reorientating some of these key supply chains, is permanently risking losing its influence in Asia because of this kind of push towards decoupling. I hope I've got your question broadly right, Yoichiro. Now, with those two questions on the table, perhaps we could start, if you're ready, with Liz and Natasha first, if you would like to come back at one or both of those questions. Thanks.
Which one of us?
As you like.
Okay, since I have the mic, let me respond to the question from Yoichiro Sato. This actually speaks to a little bit of recent research that I have done with Jason Young and David Cappy at Victoria University of Wellington, looking at the tech war between the US and China. And my response to your question and comment is that the US attempting to use its leverage by putting pressure on Chinese firms is, I think you're correct, this is something that ultimately can will hurt the US in certain ways. Obviously the direct commercial interests of US companies that are doing profitable business with Chinese entities that might have found themselves on the blacklist. But of course, the Chinese response has been quite predictably to accelerate its efforts to develop a much more autonomous technological capacity, which ultimately will sort of just speed up the process by which it becomes a more formidable competitor and strategic rival. Where, and I'm borrowing very much from Jason Young's take on this because he's the China expert, not me. It does seem, however, that China probably was heading in this direction anyway. So, I wouldn't over-exaggerate the significance of the US action because it might simply be a matter of speeding up something that, would have happened anyway. In terms of the implications for other regional states, I actually think it's a mixed bag because in some countries have benefited from at least the short-term sort of unfolding of this rivalry. So I think if you look at Vietnam, which has benefited from some relocation of industry from China, or even if, not that they've put it on record, but the Singaporeans probably have found it easier to stick with Nokia and Ericsson for their 5G infrastructure because of the opening up and the order book that these companies have as a result of US actions. So I think it's a mixed picture, and I'm not quite sure whether we should, you know, the US has certainly provoked a response, but I'm not sure whether that's just a matter of having sort of shortened the time frame for something that would have happened anyway.
And should I jump in?
Yes, please. Yes, please. Yeah.
Thank you. And look, I've just so enjoyed hearing these really, really fantastic presentations. So thank you to Natasha and Alice, and certainly so much food for thought. I mean, there's a couple of issues in play here, I guess. And the first one, Feng-Chi's question about the extent to which, I guess, Natasha and I agree or disagree about the extent to which the mindset should be understood as a kind of center of thinking of what is a developmental state. And I think actually Natasha and I probably furiously agree mostly, which is that and to the extent that my argument is certainly not that institutional capacity or formal organizational capacity doesn't matter. Absolutely. It is just crucial to being able to explain the extent to which some states are able to translate their ambitions into action, really. And I think that what really distinguishes Northeast Asia's developmental states from those elsewhere isn't necessarily that the mindset is completely unique to these states. I mean, I actually think you can see a developmental mindset in small pockets of policy-making communities all over the globe. You know, when we think, especially when I look at efforts at industrial policy making in some small areas in Australia, you would say, yeah, I can see that kind of constellation of understandings and ideas informing the advocacy of a particular approach. But what I think makes Northeast Asian cases particularly unique are the extent to which particular actors have been able to share this mindset and have been able to build a consensus around this particular way of thinking, and then to navigate and manipulate their existing institutional arrangements to actually translate that ambition into action. So where you see what we would kind of consider developmental states emerge is where you see a kind of synergy between not just the mindset, but the institutional capacity as well. And I think for sure, I agree with Natasha that you do see, there's certainly evidence of the mindset in Southeast Asia, but where we would fall short of calling these states developmental states is that paired mindset plus institutional capacity. And then I think, you know, the point that Alice made about regional diversity is so important in that context. And what, in many ways, I think what's led us to neglect, or perhaps some of us in any case, to overlook or to focus more on what unites the region rather than the differences within, goes back to these foundational questions, the kind of questions that we were trying to answer at the beginning, which is, you know, well, why have some countries in East Asia managed to develop so quickly, for example, and what makes them different from countries in other regions? And I see that there's this really interesting question in the chat from Nick B, who's saying, well, you know, to what extent are we really trying to bring this dialogue about bring our discussions of East Asia into dialogue with what's happening elsewhere? And there's of course been quite a lot of research then on the extent to which other states are developmental states. You know, are we seeing the emergence of developmental states in other contexts? Is the US a developmental state? You know, there's been all of this these debates recently. And to what extent is the US now, the government kind of trying to manage this competition with China by engaging in some kind of strategic techno-industrial governance? And this is, of course, where there's some super interesting work going on. The work, Linda Weiss's 2014 book on America Inc. And more recently, Linda and I have done a paper kind of comparing what we see as the key differences between the domestically focused economic statecraft of the US and of countries in East Asia. Probably just spoken quite a long time there, so I'm going to hand over, but happy to come back to some of those issues if it would be helpful.
Just to add to that, and please can I encourage the panel to cut in if you've got related interventions. I mean, I agree with Liz. I mean, there is a sort of parallel and temporally different experiences of development in other regions of the world, which has spawned their own sort of, fairly interesting and unique takes on some of these themes that we've talked about. I mean, I'm reminded that I just spent a lot of last week reading about, the original developmental ideas in Latin America, for example, right, between the 50s and the 70s. Catherine Sicking's early works was on that theme, talking about another female scholar. And also literature on, post-Soviet states and their choices about economic integration or, moving away from the post-Soviet sort of sphere. So I think that there are interesting regional studies of these themes across the world. And part of the challenge, Nick B is right. It's about sort of bringing the next stage of the conversation into a rather more comparative perspective, perhaps. Of course, first step is we've got to get, some degree of parameters around the sort of East Asian experience, which I guess is what we're trying to get at here. Alice, would you like to respond to any of those, or shall I open this up a bit more? You're muted, Alice.
Yeah, I know. Sorry, I was pressing the wrong button. Yeah, no, I mean, so I'll just simply add, building off of what Liz had said earlier as well, that, even though obviously an important point that I want to make is that I do think we need to think about, the pluralism of East Asia, because I do think that that's an important distinctive feature of Asia. And I made that argument also partly because I think regional frameworks bring them all together, right? And so that's what makes, I think, regional organizations in Asia especially interesting, partly because, there is, even though there's a range of institutions, we also have these sets of institutions that have basically prioritized inclusiveness, right? And so they've maximized diversity. And so that becomes part of the feature. The other thing I was just going to add, just to kind of complicate things or to kind of bring into the discussion a little bit, is that, I totally agree, right, with Liz, that, there are clusters, right? I mean, there are things that draw states together. Otherwise, I think we wouldn't have anything to really talk about as much, So, and I also, tend to think that, as a cluster, even if there may be important variation, as Natasha puts it, that there is a kind of broadly shared developmental imperative, to use Evelyn's words, that shape the region's dynamics. This having been said, I also think, right, that things don't remain static. And so there's changes, right, that get layered and they evolve, and sometimes we go into different paths. So I just thought I'd bring that into another part of the discussion.
Thank you. Amy's got her hand up, Amy King. So please go ahead, Amy.
Look, thank you very much for such a terrific discussion. I mean, this was a real masterclass on how to think about Asian security and political economy, and I'll be recommending it to my students forevermore. I guess my question sort of touches upon something that came out in the previous discussion about the comparative element in all of this, because I think in each of your remarks there was a strong comparative thread initially between the respective concepts or cases that you study and presumably that of the West, whether it was the US or the European case. Obviously, Liz, in your case, you're probably responding to Chalmers Johnson's first comparison with a Western political economy. But then what came through in each of your remarks was an increasing need to pluralize our understanding of East Asia itself, and a sense that actually the baseline against which you are comparing might be within Asia as well as with the West itself. Now, my question is probably a bit of a prosaic one, partly in terms of sort of publishing strategies and kind of production of knowledge. I mean, part of it reflects, I'm sure, the political weight and geographic biases of our disciplines. You know, you have to respond to the West in some extent to show, you know, what's new about your case. Do you see, or have you seen in your field over time, a shift where you can explain Asia on its own terms, or within Asia on its own terms, or, as I think Liz was sort of hinting, a sense that you can use concepts derived from within your studies of Asia to actually explain other parts of the world, whether that's, you know, clean energy policies in development states, or regional integration, or state institutions, for instance. Thank you.
Would anyone like to?
Let me have a go at responding. Still thinking it through, and I guess this is partly a response to your question, Amy, as well as the previous one about comparing regions. My own sense is that, you know, anyone who has studied IR in a sort of Western or English speaking, or being sort of integrated in that IR world, will have some baseline level of familiarity with the sort of the post-war history of, you know, cross-Atlantic relations, the Cold War, and will therefore have some sense of this is how Europe works, and there's something different going on in Asia, and that would have come through in, you know, graduate courses. And even if you were primarily a specialist in something else, your approach will probably be informed by that sort of implicit comparison. Whereas the regional specialists who work much more as sort of, you know, country specialists, my sense is that we tend to work in much sort of deeper silos. And there might be a reference to a common discipline, but we don't learn nearly as much as we should from the experiences and trajectories that unfold in other regions. And I recall about 10 years ago being part of a series of workshops that was around domestic security in Southeast and South Asia. And as a Southeast Asianist, South Asia was really unfamiliar territory to me, and the comparisons were fascinating and productive, and I wish I'd been exposed to them earlier. And I would say more recently, my own work on property rights and informal institutions, as a result of the review process for one of my articles, I was told to go read the work of an African specialist. And that was like, well, how come as a Southeast Asianist, we never read about Africa? And in the end though, what I find are more areas of commonality, from which you can sort of draw out some nice nuances and distinctions, but in a sense, the world looks closer and more similar the further you look. So I'm not sure whether this means that you view Asia in its own terms, because in some ways, my feeling is that, you know, as I said at the beginning, you can find almost every kind of state somewhere in Asia, and so there will be somewhere out there like it. And also Asia has been so inextricably subject to the competition of outside powers that I'm not quite sure what seeing it in its own terms, you know, I don't think it ever was a sort of sealed world region, obviously, which you would know. So I'd be interested to know a bit more what would that mean? What would a sort of indigenous seeing the region in its own terms mean? I'd be very curious to hear a bit more about that.
Can I add a little bit to that? So, I mean, I think that the answer to me is a little bit of both. You know, it's interesting because you framed the question in terms of it seemed that, you know, how much can we use the concepts that we find in Asia and maybe extend it or apply it elsewhere? And it's interesting because usually when I think about the challenges of thinking about Asia, it's actually the other way around, right? And so the problem to me is that, you know, as Natasha said, we've all been trained to a certain mindset. And sometimes it's hard to break free of those, right? And so I think the question of conceptualization, you know, is an important one. I think in terms of, you know, like to what extent, you know, how do we do it, right? Like how do we have them, you know, how distinct are these concepts, et cetera? You know, I think it's difficult to ignore the fact that, development takes place in a global world, right? I mean, and the global setting is really important dynamic, whether we're talking about developmental states or whether we're talking about Asian security, the global is constantly intruding. And so, which is what I get back to, one of my first, comments that I made at the start of my presentation was that I think there's a lot of familiarity in terms of the forms that we find in Asia, right? But they manifest and there are variants, of them, right? As the different actors, adapt to their particular context and circumstances, as it gets mediated through the regional context. And so I think that we find both the familiar as well as the differences if we kind of think about some of those interactions. But just my last point, and then I'll stop talking, is I think I absolutely agree that, I think, the comparative work is really important. It makes us think about what is similar and what's not. I'm working with a former student now, and, we're comparing different ideas of non-interference and how they inform regional organizations, right? In West Africa versus, Southeast Asia. Some similar global settings, right? In terms of the structures, in terms of also even some of the heterogeneity of states, but also some different outcomes, right? So anyway.
And it sounds to me like what you're describing, Alice, is what I was going to sort of quickly say. I think that there's a certain kind of approach to this, which is either issue-based or thematic-based comparative is kind of how I think about it. So, and she's just given a really good example. I was going to give others, but I won't say any more and turn over to Liz, please.
Yeah, it's such a great question, Amy. And I guess at risk of this sounding just really a very simplistic response, I guess, is I think that, I think of these concepts, they're just tools, right? They're tools to help us make sense of the world and to answer particular puzzles. And so for me, I guess how I come to these debates and to academia in general is I'm really interested in answering like really pressing puzzles like, wow, why did many countries in East Asia manage to develop so quickly? That is just such an incredible puzzle to understand. And I think that the concept of the developmental state has been really helpful because it helps us get at what is actually distinctive about that historic relationship between politics and economics. And then I think to the extent that we might want to ask, well, why is development not happening elsewhere? The concept may travel, may be helpful. And so I think that really the extent to which we can use tools and analytical approaches and concepts, it really just depends on the kinds of questions that you're really interested in answering. I think that there's been some efforts recently to kind of overstretch concepts, especially the developmental state. It's become so broadly applied now, that it's kind of lost its kind of utility. I think that would be my only, I think that as social scientists, we should be as experimental and creative as we can in kind of using as many tools as we can to understand the problems that are challenging us. But we should also be wary of the kind of dangers of overstretching concepts to the point where they become a bit meaningless, and always keep focused on, what is it that we want to know and how are these tools helping us get the answers to those questions. I hope that makes sense.
It makes eminent sense. Unfortunately, we are over time. I am conscious that people have things to get to, so I'm going to just take a moment now to offer a formal closing. I hope the panel can stick around for 5 minutes after this for us to just end this nicely with each other. But please, could you join me in thanking our speakers who have been so generous with their time? I do assure you that these conversations are pretty symptomatic of how we do generally talk about our work. So you've just sort of, witnessed a sort of live rendition of this, and there's a lot more to say, obviously. And thank you, the audience, for giving us your time generously as well, and for being here with us for this opening seminar of the series. Can I highlight at this point that each of our seminars is accompanied by a reading list of relevant scholarly publications by female scholars on the topics which are addressed. You will find the link to today's list on the seminar series website, and you will also, I think, be able to see it in the chat box now. Thank you very much, Kian. Kian's put it up in the chat box. And you know, this is an additional resource that we want to accompany every seminar in this series. You will have heard our speakers refer to their own works and other people's works variously in their presentations. So these can be found in the reading list. And we hope this additional resource will prove useful as we all try to diversify our citations and reading lists as well. Now, finally, let me say that our next event in the Women in Asia-Pacific Security Research series will be a research seminar on the 2nd of December, so exactly a month from today, by Oriana Schuyler Maestro. And she will be talking about the intriguing question of the extent to which Russia and China might be conceived of as developing an alliance and the implications of this for Asia-Pacific security. Again, the link to this event will be coming up in the chat box as well now for you. Thank you very much. And thank you all, and we will see you again at the next seminar. We will cease recording now. Thank you so much, but please stick around with us if you have time. Thank you.